Video games. Oh man, I love them. There's nothing like stepping into the shoes of someone more successful than you and pretending you're actually achieving something. But man, sometimes that's just too much work. I want to be able to kick back and experience a game without doing any sort of work and just absorbing the story. Besides, games are too complicated anyway. There's A and then B, but then Y? Like, I just learned the alphabet and you're trying to mess that up for me? That's why adapting a video game into something more passive to the consumer like a TV show or a movie is all the rage these days. And with seemingly endless streaming services coming out looking for content, it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. Will the Pepsi Man cinematic universe start soon? You never know. Video game adaptations aren't necessarily a new thing, but they've really seemed to grow in popularity within the last decade or so. There's a lot of factors in place, such as the uncertain future of these. However, I think it comes down to gaming just being more popular than ever, and Hollywood sees the dollar signs and capitalizing on those IPs. Even your little cousin plays Minecraft on their school Chromebook. With modern games needing the same types of crew as a film, such as animators, voice directors, and so on, there's quite a bit of bleed over among the two mediums. Tons of A-list actors and directors have their hands in games. It's just how it goes now. Now some games just simply wouldn't work as films, although it'll never stop them from trying, but others could translate very well. Certain games are told very cinematically, their cutscenes are framed and lit like films, and they're praised sometimes more for their story than their gameplay. And in the last couple years, there's been two which have stood out to me as meeting this criteria, but polar opposites in their adaptations. Those being The Last of Us and Halo. Halo being one of Microsoft's biggest franchises, okay, basically the only one, and The Last of Us being seen as an instant classic upon release, and is one of Sony's most beloved franchises. Wait, so you have to make exclusives to get people to buy your console? I thought it was just to make your system look like an urn. The closest we ever got to that coming true was in the mid-2000s, where Peter Jackson was producing a live-action film with Neil Blomkamp serving as director.
We first met Neil when we were considering the production of a film called Halo, based on the video game. As it was, Halo never happened.
I made a full video about that, which you should totally watch because it's just so good. Since then, there were rumors here and there that there was some kind of adaptation coming. And in 2013, Steven Spielberg announced he was executive producing a TV series. And 9 long years later, it dropped on Paramount Plus in March of 2022. Whereas The Last of Us was also rumored early on to have some kind of adaptation on the way. I can remember talks as early as 2014 of Elliot Page being cast as Ellie. And around 9 or so years after the game's release, a TV series dropped on HBO Max. I think these shows are appropriate for me to compare for good reasons. Number one, I played maybe an hour of The Last of Us before, so I'm basically experiencing the story for the first time and I'm absolutely loving it. Whereas I'm an absolute Halo fanboy and this show is utter garbage. Everything about the way the story is handled feels so real. The early signs of the outbreak, the panic, even small things like the first deliberate sign of someone turning into a zombie. A scene that really sums up the writing to me is when Joel is explaining the outbreak to Ellie.
No one knows for sure, but best guess, cordyceps mutated. Some of it got into the food supply, probably a basic ingredient like flour or sugar. There were certain brands of food that were sold everywhere, all across the country, across the world. Bread, cereal. Eat enough of it, it'll get you infected. So the tainted food all hits the store shelves around the same time Thursday. People bought it. Ate some Thursday night or Friday morning. Day goes on. They started to get sick. Afternoon, evening, they got worse. Friday night, September 26, 2003. By Monday, everything was gone.
Perfect. It's not some stupid shit like, oh, there was an experiment gone wrong and someone got bit. It was all over the news. No. He's saying it in a way where it almost sounds hypothetical. Like he's heard a bunch of people say the same stuff for years and just came to that conclusion. Even the way the zombies look is so unique for television. Remember that trend back in the 2010s where everyone got obsessed with zombies? And every zombie in every show or movie looked exactly the same, with the only difference being either they walk or run? Well, these ones are much more creative looking, but also makes sense for them to look like that from the way the virus is explained. They don't just look interesting for the sake of looking interesting. It's narratively appropriate and it works. Like, you see that guy with the fungus for a face? It's scary. Whereas Halo, on the other hand, is absolutely nothing interesting with the story. Like, when it first premiered, a buddy and I watched the first episode, and for the longest time, I didn't watch the rest of it because I just couldn't stomach it. This isn't even a case of expectations being too high. Okay, maybe after 9 years you might expect a little bit, but more so a case of objectively not enjoying the story. Once you get past the familiar images, it's just another generic sci-fi story that feels like it belongs here, and not with a $100 million price tag. See, that's the problem I had with those earlier Halo things. They were super polished and cheap looking, but had no engaging story to hold it together. But at least those were self-aware enough not to try anything more than what they were. This, however, had again nearly a decade of build-up, major studio backing, and this guy's name on it. It clearly wanted to be a heavily discussed show.
That was really bad.
I think another big aspect is who you actually have working on it. If someone hasn't worked on the franchise before or aren't at least invested in it, chances are that will bleed into the quality of the project. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of Special K, so I wouldn't be the best fit in adapting that to a movie. At least I don't think. In the case of Halo, they wanted a series that wasn't canon to the games and didn't just adapt the story people were familiar with. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. There are times where the franchise branches off into new types of stories and it turns out just fine. But here, they avoided the mainline story in favor of what exactly? Familiar plot beats with beaten-to-death themes and bland characters. Take Master Chief, for example. Is he a strong and deep character in the games? No, not exactly. He's more so a vessel for the player, which is why he's a mostly silent protagonist. And while I still think something like that could work, as similar characters have worked very well in media before, I can at least understand the thought process of wanting to expand his character. But what have they replaced him with? Nothing more than just a generic military man. Here's an example. In the original games, Homeboy never takes his helmet off. You can tell what he's feeling just from his body language. But here in episode 1, oh, there it goes. And even in the expanded lore, when it's explained what John Chief looks like, even that's interesting. His skin is paper white and frail, his eyes are sunken in and dark from never seeing natural sunlight. He is a husk of a person who hides in his suit because he can't relate to anybody around him. But here, nope, crew cut, 5 o'clock shadow, boring. Now let's take it back to The Last of Us. Another show that deviates from the source material, but only when they feel it's needed. Now again, I haven't really played the game yet, but from what I know, the characters Bill and Frank's backstory isn't really explored. Yet in the series, they have an entire episode dedicated to them, and it's arguably the best one yet. Sure, it's mostly a lore episode and doesn't advance the plot much, but it's incredibly well told and deviates from the tone of the show in a great way. It's far from one note. Another aspect I wanted to touch on is the music. Now, even if you're not a fan of Halo, you know where its music comes from if you hear it. It's iconic at this point. Do they use the score or at least some of the themes of the games? Nope, not really. Now on paper, again, that's fine since they're trying to make a distinction between the series and the games. There are shows that take different approaches from the mainline series where the music is still great and fits the tone. However, what we have to listen to is a generic, boring action score with no memorable cues. So you remove one of the most iconic scores of the last few decades, which is part of the reason the franchise was such a success to begin with, in favor of what's essentially wallpaper music. It's frustrating. I understand there's a lot of legal issues with the score, but come on, you can do better than a score that even YouTubers would put to shame. Now you take a listen to The Last of Us score, and it's memorable and fitting to what's on screen. It has this simple acoustic arrangement that really adds to the road trip aspect of the show. But then it gets very tense, like during the Indonesian scenes. Again, I haven't heard the music from the games yet, but if you were to tell me they used the score from one in the other, I would believe you. From what I've seen of the game, it would fit there, and as I've said, it fits perfectly in the series. The last thing I want to touch on is maybe the most important aspect of either. Their purpose. Why would you take a series that worked just fine as a video game and adapt it for TV? Well, there are strengths that come with scripted TV that you can't get in games. There's a reason why most games aren't heavy on cutscenes or exposition. It takes away from the player experience. Again, almost none of the third episode would have worked in a game, so it's good that they were given that breathing room. And the purpose of making it a series is to flesh out the story more. Druckmann felt that there was stuff in the story that couldn't be done in the game, so it was told in the series. But in doing so, you need to rework some elements as they would only work in the game story. But also on the flip side, you need to rework some elements as they would only work in a game story structure. Halo is cinematically told as well, but there are things you would need to cut or rework to fit into a film or series. Like, I love Assault in the Control Room, but most of that level is basically just filler. But once again, when watching the show, they go for a completely different story that has nothing to do with the games and totally reworked how the world operates just for the sake of it. I'm not even someone who super cares about the lore of a series, but when you change and downgrade elements for no real reason, I find it baffling. Like, why do the Jackals use energy swords? It's not even just dumb because it's not lore friendly or whatever, but it just doesn't make sense. The elites are the ones who use the swords because they're essentially like warrior samurai guys. The show suffers from an identity crisis. It feels like they felt obligated to make a Halo project since one was floating around for so long, but they could never figure out what to do. Like, apparently the script was rewritten over 200 times. That's confidence in your story, wouldn't you say? And when watching it, you can tell it's trying to be so many different things. This came out a couple years after The Mandalorian, and it feels like they're heavily borrowing from it. Chief even sounds like he's doing a Mando impression at times.
Master Chief 117, recording on the planet Magical. I can bring you in warm, or I can bring you in cold.
This feels like Paramount needed a show to bring people to their service, and Halo was recognizable enough of an IP, so they just threw money at this to finish the project, but also made it different enough to try to appeal to a wider audience. But in doing so, you have a series that appeals to no one. Halo fans will be pissed, and regular people will be confused or bored. It's a generic sci-fi with a budget that only sometimes shows off. Video game adaptations show no signs of stopping, and people's standards for them are getting higher. A show like The Last of Us is praised, while a show like Halo is hated because one is just more quality than the other. Which is a good thing to see. People should demand more from their media. Will things ever be perfect? No, but they aren't in any genre. I think we just need a few more years of development so that the people who grew up with the games and understand them can helm these types of projects. For example, I would love to see a gritty retelling of those Flash stick figure games from the early 2000s. The nuances would translate very well to television under the right care.